It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the National Science Foundation, as well as JST and Dr. Craig Henderson for the invitation to join you today and visit. I'm going to talk today about some lessons learned from US organizational diversity initiatives. So in Japan, there is increasing emphasis on gender diversity. These are headlines from international media talking about gender diversity within Japanese organizations, such as women kind of being held back by half the nation being held back in Japan through policies and a history of workplace policies that women are not fully included. Prime Minister Abe's move to have more daycare to increase the participation of women in science, as well as celebrations of historic firsts, like women being appointed to corporate boards. Japanese organizations are also promoting diversity. This is a webpage from Mitsubishi Corporation exploring kind of gender in the workplace and having strategies for childcare and celebrating women in the workplace and certifications for being a childcare-friendly workplace. New laws in Japan are also promoting gender diversity. So the female empowerment law looks a lot like some of the early employment discrimination and gender promoting laws in the US, and that's making news in Japan. Yet in Japan, women remain underrepresented in the workforce, including STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. You can see here the percentage of the STEM workforce that is female in Japan is one of the lowest in the world at 14.4%. And that's kind of in spite of the fact that women are earning much more degrees and closer to parity in college education, including in the sciences. There are more women in sciences getting college degrees than there are in the STEM workforce. So why is this important? From this graph, you can see the green section in the middle is basically the bulk of the Japanese workforce, and these are projections over time. And you can see that the workforce is declining in large part from a smaller birth rate as years go by, as well as an increasing older population. So in a very real sense, women's underutilization is extremely relevant to building and maintaining a workforce in Japan. So the workforce in general, as well as STEM, is missing out on potential talent by not reaching in and tapping to women in society. Women themselves are missing out on well-respected careers in STEM. And STEM is missing out on women's perspectives. So these photos provide two examples here. The first is some of the early work on, thank you. Airbags. Some of the earliest airbags that were engineered were done by male design teams, and they were made based on the size of men's bodies. So when they were activated in auto accidents, they were injuring and in some cases killing women and smaller people. So that design team lacked the insight of women, and their perspective had a direct impact for the product that was developed. This ice cube and woman here is another example of how not having women's opinions can shape the products that come out of research and design teams. So office thermostats were designed based on men's bodies, and men and women have different physiology where women literally need it to be warmer. So in offices around the world, women are literally being chilled and frozen in a lot of cases because the thermostats were built for men, not for women. There's also research on the proportion of women in a group and how that can shape the collective intelligence of a group. And by collective intelligence, we're talking about how groups perform on a wide variety of tasks, like puzzles and verbal tasks. And when a group performs very well on a set of tasks, that can be related to their objective performance on other tasks, like how well that group competes against a computerized checkers game, for example. And what we learned from this work on collective intelligence is that groups are better at solving problems and literally smarter when there are more women in those groups. And that happens because women are more in tune with the other people in their groups, and they're able to harness the power of their interpersonal sensitivity to develop better solutions and read the minds of those in their groups so that they're literally solving problems better. So what have we in the US done to increase diversity in terms of gender and other varieties of groups that Dr. Craig Henderson referenced in her remarks? One of the major things that we have done is introduced a number of diversity initiatives. So these are some examples. So the first picture here is from Microsoft, and it's typical of what you might see on an American web page at a major organization. It talks about, for example, workplace groups where women interact with other women, and how there are resources for childcare, as well as basically saying we value women, we value this group. And it's meant to attract women into the workplace, as well as signal that it's an organization that welcomes women's perspectives. Another common strategy is like leadership programs, so kind of programs where women are mentored, for example, to develop their leadership skills and become managers within organizations. And one of the most common ways we promote diversity in the US is through diversity training. So this is a picture from Google, and they do a number of workshops on all types of biases, and this is on unconscious bias, so our subtle biases that we possess. And they teach managers and employees about how biases shape our decision making. And these types of interventions are extremely common, where people learn about bias and how it will affect decision making in the workplace. Now, despite the ubiquity of these programs throughout US organizations, we know very little about how they work. Do they broaden participation and increase diversity? So this is a quote from Frank Dobbin and Sandy Calev, who are two sociologists who reviewed this literature, and they argue today these diversity programs are the main channels through which anti-discrimination legislation is implemented, yet we know surprisingly little about their effects. When Calev and Dobbin looked at US organizational diversity initiatives, they looked at over 30 years of data and found out what these organizations did in terms of initiatives to increase diversity, and then looked at the percentage of women and other ethnic minority groups in the US that were promoted into management positions over time. And what they find is that many US diversity initiatives, including the most popular ones like diversity training, do very little to increase diversity. So everything above 0 would be an increase in women or ethnic groups as part of management. So you can see very much these groups don't increase after most of the major types of diversity initiatives. Sometimes it actually can make things worse for some groups. What I want to talk about are not just the fact that some of the most common strategies don't actually increase diversity, is that sometimes these diversity initiatives have unintended consequences for women. And I hope by learning about them today, I'll return later at the talk to talk about what we can do to fix these unintended consequences, as well as some guidance for Japanese organizations so they don't make some of the same mistakes that we have made in the US as we've tried to increase diversity. I will talk about two unintended consequences. The first is something we dub the illusion of fairness. So diversity initiatives like diversity training can lead to a false sense of fairness regarding women's treatment in the workplace. We can assume it's fair for them, even when it might not be. And the second one I'll talk about is something we refer to as a stigma of incompetence. So groups that are assumed to have benefited from diversity initiatives are sometimes seen as less competent than groups that are not targeted by diversity initiatives, even when there is no difference in their competence. So with the illusion of fairness, we have argued that the mere presence of diversity initiatives may lead to a false sense of fairness about women's treatments. So these diversity initiatives, like diversity training, are cues that signal that a workplace is fair for women and other groups. When we learn that organizations are fair or that places use fair procedures, our assumption is that we are satisfied with the outcomes, even when those outcomes disadvantage groups. If we assume the procedures are fair, then we think everything is okay. So I will tell you about two experiments we have done to look at this question. We had white male participants learn about a company that offered either diversity training or, in a control condition, general managerial training. So participants saw one of these two descriptions of a company's program. The top was the control group, the general managerial training, and basically it talks about how the company has a program called Fostering Employee Success, and it talks about how that is a training program in that organization. In the diversity condition, the content is nearly identical to the general management training program, except that we note that it references women. So it's called Fostering Women's Success instead of Fostering Employees' Success. And there are a few other differences where we talk about gender diversity. But overall, two very similar statements, and they are assigned to look at just one of those. They then view personnel records that show that 20 men and 20 women who are identically qualified, just as good as each other, are being considered for promotions at the company or for interviews for promotions. And when they see the list of who gets offered interviews, they learn that men are more likely than women to be offered interviews, even though men and women are identical in their qualifications. So the procedure objectively disadvantages women. We then asked participants to indicate whether the company used fair procedures in its selection process. So we asked them, well, were women treated with respect? Were the procedures fair and applied consistently for men and women? And our prediction here was that when the organization offered diversity training, participants would assume the company was fair, even when they just saw evidence it was unfair. And yes, they recognized that women did worse than men at this organization. Nonetheless, when they learned that the company had a diversity initiative, you can see here that they thought the company was more fair for women compared to the control condition. So quite literally, they interpreted the evidence they saw differently as a function of those few words in that diversity training description. So when a company has a program that manages diversity, participants assume it's fair, even in spite of evidence that it is not fair. We did another experiment looking at wage discrimination. So this is kind of the percentage that women are underpaid relative to men in various nations. Here's Japan, and here is the US. Our participants were in the US. So we told them basically to look at a list of men and women who were paid by a company, and the men and women were equally qualified. But we told them the truth, that women made only 81% of what the men made. And we looked at how they interpreted that difference. Did they think that there was discrimination or sexism involved? And when they had read about a company that offered gender-based diversity training, they said the company was less sexist than when it had that control training that I showed you. So quite literally, again, they took the same piece of discriminatory evidence and interpreted it as okay, as not discriminatory, when an organization claimed to care about diversity. The second illusion I want to talk about, or the second problem here, is the stigma of incompetence. And this is work that comes from Madeline Hillman's lab at New York University in the United States. And she has found across a number of studies over the last decade or so that groups that are assumed to benefit from diversity initiatives are falsely perceived as incompetent, as less skilled. So they argue that diversity goals, so diversity initiatives, are viewed as interfering with kind of pure merit or pure deservingness. And this is a false assumption because it assumes that the workplace is genuinely fair and that the most meritorious candidates advance, which we know from a lot of research on bias is not the case. So they basically will show people information about different employees. In this particular experiment I'm telling you about, they saw information about a male employee, a female employee, or a female employee they learned who was hired through a diversity initiative to broaden participation. In all cases, the employee was identical, so equally competent, equally qualified, the same amount of experience. The only difference was the assumed gender of the candidate, as well as whether or not they were hired under the diversity initiative. They then had participants look at that information, and they asked them, how competent are these employees? And what they find is that overall, men are perceived as more competent than an equally identically qualified woman, so that's the bar here. but also that if a woman is hired under a diversity initiative, she's assumed to be even less incompetent. So remember that the qualifications were exactly the same. It's just a description of how she was hired. So some evidence that organizations that have diversity initiatives might unintentionally be leading their employees who are hired through those programs to be perceived as less competent. So what have we learned, and what advice do I have based on this for organizations in Japan that are approaching diversity management in the workplace? So despite their best intentions, diversity initiatives can sometimes have unintended consequences. They can lead to an illusion of fairness, where we assume organizations that value diversity are fair for women and other groups, even when presented with evidence that they are not fair. So I think it's important that we remain vigilant to discrimination, even when we are in organizations that value diversity and truly believe that we care about diversity. It can prevent us from seeing injustice. So it's important to remain vigilant to how different groups are being treated in the workplace, even when we see ourselves as progressive and fair. With the stigma of incompetence, it's very important to frame our diversity initiatives in a way that emphasize merit. And what Howman and colleagues have found is when they talk about diversity initiatives, they can eliminate that stigma of incompetence when they say we looked at highly qualified, highly meritorious candidates, but we broadened our strategies so that we do a better job with recruitment, that we're more fair. But by emphasizing merit, those women are no longer seen as less competent than men. Additionally, I think in moving forward, it will be very important to follow the data. So evidence-based approaches to diversity will be critical. It's going to be important to ask ourselves, what works? What do the data tell us about these various strategies we're implementing, and how can we learn from them to implement things that are effective and tweak those that are less effective? So I am coming back to the other half of a graph that I had blocked when I showed it to you earlier. So again, above the zero means that these programs increase diversity. There are several programs and diversity initiatives that are very effective, that increasing the percentage of women and ethnic minorities in organizations. The problem in the US is that we don't use them very often. They're a little more expensive, and they require thinking differently about diversity. These are mentoring programs, diversity task force, and diversity managers. So the latter two being groups that are responsible for advocating for diversity, and they provide oversight within an organization. So with mentoring, what that can do is engage managers and decision makers in diversity goals. They can share their experiences. They can talk with women, for example, and help them learn from their own strategies and give them connections to other important people in the workforce so that information is being shared with women so they're not isolated, but they're in fact part of the larger group that we think of as kind of the center core of the workplace. And this can be beneficial with managers, whereas diversity training can make managers feel like they're the problem, that they're biased, that they're making prejudiced decisions. With mentoring, they feel like they can be part of the solution. And that is one reason why mentoring works to increase diversity in organizations. The other two programs, the task force and the manager, are very important because they give a unit or a person responsibility for increasing diversity. They're given resources, and that is their main job. So if you are on a hiring committee, you know that there will be someone from the diversity task force or somebody who's a diversity manager who will ask you questions about why did the interview list have mostly men on it? What happened to women? Where did they fall out? So people know their actions will be things they are held accountable for. And also what these diversity task force and managers can do is follow the data. So they can look at strategies that are effective and use those and expand them within the workplace. They can look at strategies that are less effective and work with them and eliminate them. So having someone solely responsible for this and giving them the resources has positive benefits for diversity in the workforce. I want to thank the people who worked on this project with me, my social identity lab at the University of Washington, as well as our major collaborating lab, the Self and Social Identity Lab at the University of California at Santa Barbara, as well as generous funding from the National Science Foundation and the James McKean Cadell Sabbatical Fellowship. And thank you for listening.